It's my privilege to have another interview guest here today on my YouTube channel. This is Seth Alcorn, who has been in pastoral ministry. I don't know how long. He's about to tell us. In fact, I usually like to let folks introduce themselves. So Seth, can you just tell the viewers of my YouTube channel, how do you serve the body of Christ?
Well, thank you, Mark, for inviting me to be here today. And I just want to say up front how much I appreciate and admire your work. This is a divisive issue. Doesn't need to be, but it has become that. And I appreciate not only your content, but just the gracious spirit that you approach it in.
I'm going to stop you for 1 second, Seth, because I just realized this is unprofessional. I didn't say what we were talking about. And so the divisive issue that you're talking about, you know, if viewers couldn't have already guessed, it's King James Onlyism. And the reason I asked Seth to come on, and this will come out in much more detail, is that he made an attempt to move his church as a pastor out of King James Onlyism, to move away from that doctrine. And that attempt failed. And I actually wanted to get wisdom on those issues. So let's get some clarity here. Go on, Seth. How do you serve the body of Christ?
Okay, well, I am a pastor right now. I have been in pastoral ministry since 2007. I've served the majority of that time in the lead pastor role. I served as an assistant for a year, but I became a Christian when I was 19 years old and went off to Bible college. And really for me, the whole King James issue was not a question. Just accepted it. Because I'd been involved in churches like that and through the teaching of my Bible college. So nonetheless, that's where I am. I serve now in Locust Grove, Virginia, which is right outside of Fredericksburg, which is pretty much a suburb of Washington, D.C. At this point. So we're about an hour and a half from the D.C. area.
My grandmother lives there right now. What's it called? There's a community not that far from the highway. I've been there many times, and I used to live in Northern Virginia. I was born in Alexandria, so I know that area pretty well. Yeah. Now, you and I talked, at some length via Facebook Messenger, and that was some time ago, and I just wanted to say up front myself, the reason I wanted you to come on is I want to reinforce the message of gracious people when it comes to King James Onlyism. I don't want to get in with the rabble-rousers. And I've been really impressed that so many individuals I've spoken with that have left King James Onlyism, or maybe not left those circles, but no longer hold the doctrine, now hold what I would call an orthodox bibliology. They have been gracious, and they've been grateful for the good things they got within King James Onlyism. And you struck me as very much that same way. And I wanted to hear your story. If you were saved at 19, when did the issue of King James Onlyism, when were you first aware that it was a dispute among Christians?
Well, I mean, for me, honestly, there was no dispute because I grew up around it. My dad was a pastor. He entered in pastoral ministry when I was about 11. So every church we went to used exclusively the King James Version. It became an issue to me when I started listening to people on the radio who were not King James only. And I had a real quandary in my heart, because some of the guys that were on the radio that I was listening to on like the Bible Broadcasting Network, BBN, they were the best teachers I'd ever heard in my life. Like David Jeremiah. I'm an only child, and I can remember growing up as a kid listening to David Jeremiah in the back seat of the car. And then I become an adult and I find out he's not King James only. Stephen Davey, not King James only. And interestingly enough, I actually agree that he's the president of at this point. And I kept thinking, okay, these guys are fantastic teachers, but they're not King James only. So in my mind, they were delegated to the JV squad. If we're King James only, we're varsity, they're JV. So that little burr under my saddle just kind of sat there for a while, and it just got deeper and deeper and deeper. And as I committed to teach through books of the Bible, I was reading commentaries, and pretty much none of them, maybe outside of John Phillips, used exclusively the King James Version. So I said, I've got to dig into this and find out for myself. And when I started looking into it, I read a handful of books on both sides. But when I read James White's book, The King James Only Controversy, I realized that we as fundamentalists had been misrepresenting the position of people that didn't use the King James exclusively. We'd been saying things like they're liberals, they use perversions of the Bible, whatever the case is. So I realized that we're misrepresenting them. And then I also realized that, frankly, we were wrong. And that's where the whole issue kind of becomes a problem for me, because now I am a non-King James only pastor in a predominantly King James only church.
Not a good place to be in, not a safe place to be in, not a fun place to be in, but a place that many pastors are in right now, and I have talked to them. And I didn't give you my questions in advance. Usually I do. I'm really sorry. I thought it might be fun, interesting to have a more spontaneous conversation. I wonder, under what circumstances would you tell a guy like that, the path of integrity is just to leave. You're opposed to the doctrine that's in your doctrinal statement. You just need to go. And under what circumstances would you tell him to stay and try to work for change?
Oh man, there's so much to the issue. As you said in the introduction, for me, it was not a successful move in trying to move the church toward being, non-King James only. And to be honest with you, Mark, I really did not think it was going to be a divisive thing. I did not think it would cause division. I knew that everybody wouldn't get behind it, but I thought, the vote will probably pass 85%, and we just tried to change the stipulation to adding the New King James in to be able to use the King James and the New King James, and the church only passed that vote by 4 votes. And I can't even explain to you the mental toll, the emotional toll that it took on me and my family. And we had honestly thought we were going to be in that community for life. We loved those people. They were like family. And the whole purpose of this interview to me, and I said this from minute one when you'd asked me, I have absolutely no desire at all to sling mud or anything. I love those people to this day, and they were like family to us. It was the most difficult decision I ever made to actually leave that community and come here. But it came to the point where I just realized we had to move on. So I'm getting around to your question here.
Sure.
What would I suggest for a guy? When is it time to go? I think you got to consider a lot of things. One thing you have to consider is, what has the teaching of the church been? If it has been predominantly King James only for decades, maybe from pastors that have been there a very time, you probably just need to pack your bags and move on. What has been the influence there? Has it been more of a Bob Jones influence? If that's the case, you probably can move the church in that direction in some time. For instance, Stephen Davey used the King James to begin with when he was starting his ministry at Shepherd's Church, and they went to the New American Standard because it wasn't dyed-in-the-wool King James only. So I would say that would be a big indication if you've got a more of a Hiles type mentality, even a Ruckman influence. Your best bet is to pack your bags and move on, and I don't think there's any shame in doing that. So that would be one thing I would consider. Also, I would consider something else. I think once we come to this position that it's not central to the Christian faith, we forget that other people still feel that way. You know what I mean?
Right.
So as a pastor, I look at the King James issue now as a tier 3 issue. It's a total preferential issue. But people in your church, if they have been taught King James Onlyism, they view this as a very serious thing, probably on level with the Trinity. And if you're a pastor worth your salt, you're going to fight for that doctrine. How can we not expect people who have been taught something to fight for it when they see it as a compromise of the gospel?
It's so sad, but also in a weird way understandable. And even like I can remember feeling that way myself, and I have sympathy with that view. You feel like you're fighting for the Bible against those who are trying to undermine it. And of course, you're going to throw everything you've got at that. So let's go back a little bit in time. Let me ask two questions going back in time here. One is the first, when reading James White or listening to David Jeremiah, or whatever influence it was, what was maybe the key moment of breakthrough for you, or was there one? Did it take a number of instances? Tell me what was going on in your mind as you started to realize, wow, I don't know that this is really true, this stuff I was taught about the King James Version.
Yeah, I think it was really about a third of the way through James White's book. I really don't remember the exact moment or even what the book was talking about, but like I said, there's so much misrepresentation, ad hominem arguments, and straw men that are put up from the King James only position that once you really begin to dissect it, to me, it became a position I just could not hold anymore. And the one thing I appreciated about James White's book is he deals with, some of the arguments that, of Westcott and Hort and that type of thing. And, since then I've learned that when you begin to talk about Westcott and Hort, you're, pretty much generations away from modern scholarship. But nonetheless, you're taught a lot of things like that, and it just began to crystallize to me that this is not the right path. I appreciated your book in the way that you come across, and you dealing with it more from an English perspective. I think White's is more of a, if I could say it, like an academic style book, right, against that position. Yours is more of a practical pastoral, because the people in our congregations have not had training in textual criticism or Greek and Hebrew.
Right. Yeah, that's helpful. So the second question would be, okay, you start to realize I've got to pastor these dear people that I love, shepherd them away from this ditch, from this error that is swallowing some of them up and influencing others negatively. It's not helping anyone to teach something that isn't true about the Bible. And you're thinking, okay, I might have an 85% vote. What kind of wise preparations did you try to make to try to avoid what eventually did happen?
Looking back on that, I can be honest, Mark, I haven't thought about this in a while because, time kind of heals all wounds, and it's been 3 years down the road. But in preparation of this interview, I was thinking about what I would do differently. Once I came to the conclusion I'm not King James only anymore, I talked to 10 pastors and asked them, tell me what I should do. All but 2 of them told me, stay and teach. Because it wasn't like I'd been there a year and a half. I mean, I had been there at that point for 8 years. And I really believed that if there was going to be a change, I mean, it probably was going to come from somebody like me that had been there and buried the dead, married, the young people in the church, and really been there for people. And like I said, man, I mean, this is family, But I probably went about it in ways that I would not do it now. I just at times would reference, like the New King James or the ESV in my sermons. And I remember the first time I did, it was like, all the air was sucked out of the room, it felt like. But I did that. I talked to my leadership about it. I had a lot of one-on-one conversations. And those types of things I felt like went really well. And I didn't have a lot of people that were just, yeah, we don't agree with this one-on-one. I think it was just a lot of, things kind of happening in the background. But another thing I did, and I would recommend this as well, is to hand out your book. And this is, you didn't tell me to say that. And
No,
give
I
me,
didn't.
Yeah.
Just so everyone knows.
But I did that, once I read your book. I thought it was great to try to help shape the congregation because it's, number one, it's short. It's not, 400 pages long, and it deals with the English like I've already mentioned before. So I would, if I thought there was someone who would have a hard time with the decision, I would, write a nice note on the inside of it and give it to somebody and say, hey, here's some of my thoughts on it. Looking back on it, I think I probably should have done more of a series on bibliology, like a 4-week series on bibliology, and talk about inspiration and inerrancy, those different types of things that, pastors oftentimes study from systematic theology that, people that are in your church that are working 40 hours a week don't have time to study. And then deal with the translation aspect at the end of it.
So, on the one hand, yes, just want to say I didn't ask you to plug my book, though I'm very grateful for it. But, maybe this isn't the best advertisement for it because ultimately your efforts failed. And now let's talk through that. Like, what actually went down? When did you first realize, whoa, this is not going according to my plan?
Oh, man. Really, when we as a church voted on it. And I thought because all of my leadership was behind the decision that the vote would pass significantly. And like I said, we only looked at it from like King James, New King James. And at that point, I had come to the place where I felt like any version, outside of maybe the New World Translation was acceptable. But I thought that would be the easiest way to move to maybe the New King James because it's translated out of the TR and Masoretic text and all of that. But I realized things were not going to change when we actually had the vote. We sat down and we voted on it, and it only passed by 4 votes. And I realized at that point that it's only a matter of time. And, I realized, we could try to stay and continue to fight. But, I mean, even on the spot, when the vote came in and we called it out to the congregation, I just simply said, hey, this is causing more division than I want. I don't want it to be divisive. I won't use it. I'll just stick with the King James. And what was even more painful was my wife was at home having a miscarriage that day. And we didn't,
Seth.
yeah, we didn't, and we had gone years without having kids. And I mean, to the point where we got the permanent, surgery, for that. And, anyway, but decided we wanted to have another one. And man, it was just like, wave after wave hit us. And I realized after that vote and just how things went months after that if we did not make a move, there was probably going to be a group in the church that would have tried to get us to leave.
So your church presumably had some form of church membership and therefore, voting members, and that's why you could count, that the vote was won by only 4 members. How many members did you have? Like, what percentage of the total membership was represented by 4? And are you happy with the way that membership was practiced there, or was that part of what went wrong in your estimation?
As far as I'm concerned, if somebody is on the church roll and you're in a congregational church, you should be able to, kind of vote your conscience on something. If you have more of a democratic form of church government, I've kind of come away from that, significantly from where I was. But yeah, I think when you go through that process, it needs to be, a fair, upright vote. And if people are members in good standing, they should be able to vote their conscience on that. But one thing I would suggest to guys who are looking at maybe moving from the King James only position and transitioning their church away from it, I would encourage you to make sure your roles are purged. And and that's just pastoral common sense nowadays. And one thing I think a lot of people don't understand, they might not understand the biblics of church membership and why that is important.
Right,
but
right.
90% of people that are evangelical Christians today understand the importance of not getting sued. And pretty much everybody understands that's potential today. And
Right.
we're moving closer and closer to that. Now, I don't think it's deceptive at all to lead the church in that direction for that purpose. Because I'm going to tell you, I've been a pastor since 2007. I don't want to be in a lawsuit. So if there's a way that I can keep away from that, I want to purge my roles.
And that means removing people who haven't been attending, for X number of months. We're not saying find the people we disagree with and, clean them off the church rolls. Saying these people, what are you saying? What is a purge?
A purge is if somebody has not attended your church in the last 3 to 6 months, they do not need to be a member anymore. Now, there's a theological reason for that.
Right.
Oh, exactly. The theological reason for that is you are confirming someone as a body of Christ and as a church leader, basically saying we believe this person has good standing as a follower of Jesus Christ, and they obviously do not.
Right. If they're openly disobeying what he says.
Exactly. If somebody's out of church for 6 months, they have something spiritually wrong with them, and it's very possible that they are not Christians. So you are not helping people from a spiritual perspective if you're not stepping in there and purging your roles. Number one, which is a form of discipline,
Right.
but then also from a practical perspective, why should people be allowed to step in and who haven't been to church in 6 or 7 years? I mean, I know of churches that are in my hometown in North Carolina that, man, they have people that don't come at all until there's a business meeting. And then they vote, and they can go completely against the pastor and the church leadership. It's insanity. So that is something that I think pastors have to work towards. And really, if you're in kind of a traditional Baptist church, which most people listening to this interview will be on that scale, you might have a lot of people on the roll that need to be taken off because they're not faithful to church.
Yeah, and let's say that even if you're totally happy with the doctrine at your church, you planted the church, you're not having any conflicts or potential ones over King James Onlyism or any other doctrine, that's still the right practice. We're not saying purge your church rolls so that you can win in some dispute. We're saying this is what pastoring means. This is a sheep who's wandered off into, another pasture or possibly into a ravine, and you've tried to reach them. They won't come back. You can't say, yes, this is one of my sheep anymore. You're not Christ. You don't know their soul. But as far as you're concerned, you've got to make that judgment. Yeah, that is what, the ecclesiologists that I listen to say that's what it means for Jesus to hand the keys to the apostles. That's some good wisdom there to toss in. Now, let's get back to the story here. I hear you telling me how difficult it was, and I hear it in your voice, and I didn't know until this interview, and my shoulders just slumped to hear this, that your wife had a miscarriage that very day. I mean, I really understand that. Can I just ask, why aren't you bitter? Why is it that when I was talking to you over Facebook Messenger, I thought this is a good guy to talk to? Why aren't you madder than you are?
I think, Mark, probably when we first touched base with each other, I probably was. Mm-hmm. And, tears are coming to my eyes as we speak now, but, God has done such a wonderful work in my life.
Praise
and
God.
demonstrating his grace to me. That I don't have any animosity at all. That I couldn't say that 2.5 years ago. And honestly, I completely understand why people got upset about it. There's so much more that goes into it than just giving logical arguments.
Right.
That's really not enough. You've got to think about, like we already talked about, if this has become a doctrinal issue for people, they're going to fight for that because they love God and the Spirit lives within them. Now, I would argue that is an incorrect teaching, but they've been taught that this is a tier 1 or a tier 2 issue at least. And yeah, they're going to fight over that. I understand that now. I didn't understand that then. And also, I think another thing we don't consider is the relationship that a pastor has with his sheep is something that if you've never had it, you cannot fully explain it and understand it. I remember, the first time people called me pastor and what that meant to me.
So,
And I believe that, and this is just my homespun philosophy here. Everybody seems to have like really one person that they have really connected with as a pastor, church members, at least one. And if you have been led to Christ by somebody that was King James only, or you went to a church where somebody taught you the Bible and they grew significantly and they were King James only, or you were there for them, or that pastor was there for them when their loved one died and he's King James only. When you come out and say, I'm no longer King James only, you've not only changed your position, but you've positioned yourself against that pastor that they were deeply connected with. And that's when it becomes extremely personal. And that's what we see happening in 1 Corinthians 1, where Paul says, you all are divided amongst your teachers. You say, well, I'm an Apollos guy. I only listen to Peter. Now, carnal as that may be, that just is a reality of what pastors have to deal with.
Yeah, the early church, we sometimes want to look back to as this idyllic time when they had it all right. But when you actually read the letters that Paul wrote to these early churches, you're seeing, man, they had all the same problems we have and sometimes worse ones. And that is in a sad way encouraging. This is endemic to the fallen human condition. We do tend to glom on to people. And you and I are still tempted that way ourselves. It's so hard to really just let God speak without other voices shading what he says, intruding. And this is difficult because we're actually told to listen to human teachers. Ephesians 4 says they're Christ's gift to his church. 1 Peter 5 says that the younger should submit themselves to the elders. So these are all reasons. I mean, the question I ask is, why aren't you mad? And I think
I
this is
didn't
a
answer
great
that, I don't
way.
think.
Well, no, I think you are. I think you're saying one reason to be really gracious to people is that this is not only just a very human and understandable thing to do, but it's only like one tick off of what you are supposed to do. The Bible says, and I have to quote the King James because it's what's in my head and heart, esteem them highly in love for their work's sake, elders who serve well. So it's a good thing to connect with the pastor and have his influence on you and to trust him, not to trust that he's perfect, but that's kind of where it ticks over one level. One step away from what's right. It's when you're trusting somebody who is saying something that at some level you ought to know the Bible doesn't teach. And one more thought there. You started with talking about David Jeremiah, and that's one of my favorite paths to suggest to people when they just say, I just don't trust the modern versions, but I kind of come to realize that maybe King James Onlyism is wrong. Then I say, go and listen to the best Bible teachers out there, many or most of whom don't use the King James Version. And after a while, you just tell me, did you receive benefit through Christ's gift to his church, that is this person who isn't perfect any more than you are or any more than your favorite pastor is. And I think I have seen, because of the internet, a lot of people who've realized, wow, I really thought that, and I had this one guy from West Coast Baptist College telling me this. He said, I really thought that I was the only conservative guy, the one without liberal theology, who wasn't King James only. As he was moving away from the position, that's where he was at. No, the internet shows us there's tons of people out there. Yeah, so I think you are answering the question. That is a great way to be gracious back to the King James only folks that you sadly are now, distanced from. And I myself am that very way. I can't name names, but there's one individual in particular that was really influential in my life that I'm really grateful for to this day. I don't actually know for sure that he isn't emailing me back because of the King James issue, but I have some evidence to think that he is. And I just think, we will reunite in heaven. And Lord, I would love to reunite before that, but I'm afraid that's just going to have to be up to you. Yeah, so you did answer the question. Thank you for that. That's very good. Okay, a final question for you. You sent me some notes in advance. I thought that was really helpful, and you talked about the importance of having your leadership, on your team already. Now, however, you also mentioned that you thought that they were, and things still didn't end up going well for you. And obviously, I'm not going to ask you to comment on individual leaders, but given what you actually experienced, how could you have done that differently, or what advice comes out of your experience with the leadership when you speak to other pastors through this channel?
Yeah, so one thing I would say is if all of your leadership are on board, you really have to kind of do a surmising over your congregation and say, okay, who would be for this and who would be against this? And if you have, some really strong personalities that would not be for that, they could potentially become kind of the clarion call of opposition. For instance, remember Joe the plumber from
Yes.
the Obama campaign years ago? Well, who was Joe the plumber? He was really a nobody. I don't even remember what his last name was.
Me either.
But I remember that he stood up to Barack Obama. And I'm not getting into politics at all here. It's not my gig. But it serves an illustration, I think, that happens in churches at times. People, if they're looking for someone that will speak for them. And I think that's what Joe the plumber did, is he gave millions of people a voice of frustration, and they channeled their energy into him. And I think the guy ran for Congress. I can't remember if he won or not. But nonetheless, I think that kind of thing happens at times in church division, because if people don't like the decision the pastor, the leaders made, they will voice that, and they will voice it to people that they think will side with them. And if it is a strong personality, it could be very difficult to deal with.
Yeah, that's good wisdom. Let me bounce one more thought off of you. I said that was my final question. Now you made me have another one. I have found myself writing and authorize probably the stiffest lines of the book say that continued exclusive use of the King James Version in institutional context, churches, camps, mission boards, schools, is, I said, a violation of 1 Corinthians 14. And I've had some people, people I respect and came to find real friendship in push back on that, especially one guy who actually used to be a pastor under Paul Chappell at Lancaster Baptist Church out in California. And I really listened, and I've really been thinking about that comment of his over the years. He just felt like I went too far. But it's been 4 years, and since my book came out, a little over that. So that's about the amount of time I've had to think, what did I really say the right thing? And I've had to come to think, no, I really have to stand by that I can't just rest. Now, I don't mind that it might take 20 or 30 or 40 years for a given church to change. Of course, I would prefer that it not, but I recognize that's the likelihood. And what I've been telling pastors, and I've been an assistant pastor, and I've been in two churches where we transitioned from the King James to a contemporary translation, actually. We didn't have very much trouble in either one. I've, of course, observed many others. But what I've been telling pastors is you got to take some kind of step, even if it's a tiny baby step. You can't just be content. And when I hear people tell me, well, but this could split the church, I take that very seriously. And I think there are times when you back off of something because it'll split the church. But a good shepherd, I think, won't be content with that. He'll still be taking baby steps, whatever they are. And I think there are many things that you can do to try to plant seeds to, push King James Onlyism away. But whenever I anticipate the possibility of somebody just saying, I'm just going to back off of this for 10 years, 20 years, to see how it goes. I think that is multiple full generations of children going through the children's Sunday school, the Awana, what have you, and having to use a Bible translation they're not fully understanding. And then I'm back in the mode of thinking, this is unjust. People have to have God's word in their English. I can't rest. So when I talk to folks like you who've gone through these terrible trials, the upshot must be for some pastors, back off, take your time, don't push too fast forward. But I just can't find it in my heart to tell anybody, do nothing, it's okay. I wanted to bounce all of that off of you. What thoughts does that raise in your mind?
I definitely think churches are in better shape if you do have more of a contemporary translation, like you had said. And as I was in prep for this, I was thinking about the illustration Martin Luther gave about not having multiple denominations, and he did not want that at all. But he said the gospel. He said he believed that the church would begin to use the Bible like a wax nose and turn it in different directions. And we see that happening. We have seen, multiple denominations coming out of the Reformation. But Luther's contention is that the gospel was worth being freed from Roman legalism in order, if that meant that there'd be multiple denominations that would come out of that. Mark, you asked me directly, what do I think about that? I think there are times to stay and there are times to go. Yeah. I personally believe that. And I believe, I don't think it is a matter of, I do think sometimes, because most of the guys probably listening to this are going to be connected to fundamentalism and the fighting fundamentalist spirit that we oftentimes see coming out of the 20th century, the J. Frank Norris types and, that type of thing, is we even bleed that into our healthier context where we're now, as, healthier pastors, trying to unfree people from legalism. Sometimes we can still take that baggage and make this like it's Custard's last stand. And brother, if that's what God has called you to do, then go for it. But I do believe that there are times where if you know ahead of time, which is really no way you can fully know that, but if you read the tea leaves and just say, this is going to cause division, multiple splits, I think you'd be better off to go to Southern Seminary or Shepherd Seminary or the Master's Seminary or something like that, finish a Master Divinity degree, and then launch out from there if you have no other prospects.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. That's helpful. That's the voice of experience. You have a good pastoral voice. I just like listening to you. And it seems to me, I didn't know you before you went through this experience, but I think I hear and feel just some seasoning in your voice from having gone through this, and that the Lord is allowed to do that.
Yeah, there was definitely a naiveness, and like I said, I really believed that this would not be kind of an issue. And when you go through something like that, you always second guess, what could I have done? What should I have done? The providence of God God is working all things out for the furtherance of His
Amen.
will.
Amen.
And I praise God that He has given us, maturity through this, definitely. He's
Amen.
healed us in our brokenness. And, even our former church, I believe God's given them a man that loves them. And I don't have a lot of communication with the congregation there, but we still love those folks. And, he's a good brother. He and I will text every once in a while and, just praying for you, that type of thing. So God knows what He's doing. And I'm going to second guess, what somebody says they think they should do in that context. Because I heard one pastor gave me some advice when I was really young, and it's pretty worldly wisdom, kind of carnal, but I think it's true to an extent. He said, just trust your gut. And I really think at the end of the day, there's nobody else that's going to make that decision except for the guy sitting in the chair of the pastor's office. And you just need to know, brother, that if you're coming from a context where this is a really strong teaching that's connected to a lot of King James only teachers and pastors,
Right.
this could be the end of your ministry there.
And that is something that you should only risk out of love for your sheep. And I think that's a good note to end on. The sovereignty of God. God knows best. What He did for you, even in this failure, on a time of real trial, was still good for you and for all the Christians in that congregation. He's doing good things, even if they sinned in some way in this circumstance. And then we've got to be driven by love as pastors. We've got to be driven by love for those sheep. So, Seth, thank you for coming on my channel, for being a humble guy who is willing to acknowledge to the world that you failed in a sense, but actually came away with some major successes. You have a ministry still. You have a heart for God's people, and the Lord removed the temptation to, and maybe the actuality of, bitterness in your heart toward people who hurt you, and now has replaced it with love. I mean, those are all wonderful successes that I find edifying for myself. So thank you so much for coming and talking with me today.
Thanks, Mark, for the invitation. It's my honor.